This is Democracy in Lockdown, a weekly virtual conversation on the latest news about the coronavirus crisis and what it means for our democracy. This podcast is presented by Unlock Democracy. We campaign for a better democracy and a new written constitution built and owned by the people.
Hello and welcome to our second Democracy in Lockdown podcast. I am your co-host Sarah.
And my name is Trudy. So Sarah, how was your Easter lockdown?
Yeah, my Easter lockdown was pretty uneventful, to be honest. There's not a great deal that you can do while keeping to social distancing rules. But it was a relaxing one nonetheless. How about you, Trudy?
Yeah, pretty much the same. Although I did have my first onboarding call for my local mutual aid group, which has suddenly become way more organised, which was a lot of fun.
How many were on the call?
It was just more of a safeguarding call, just person to person, a little ID check, just all process stuff. So it was really nice to see some faces from the WhatsApp group though.
That sounds great.
So last week we talked about the emergency powers and our democracy during the COVID-19 pandemic. We talked about the UK response through legislation, the Coronavirus Act, and how other governments around the world have responded. We also touched on how police have been interpreting these measures.
And that brings us on really nicely to what we're going to be talking about this week. We're going to be taking a little bit more of a deep dive into civil liberties and specifically looking at policing powers. Later on in the show, we're going to be welcoming Kevin Blow, who is the coordinator of the Network for Police Monitoring, or NetPol. He's going to be joining us for a conversation about how coronavirus has changed policing powers and what the police are doing with their new powers and what the concerns and problems are there. So stay with us for that. So to kick off this episode, let's dip into some of the latest news headlines to start with. One of the big stories that I couldn't help but see was Priti Patel, who is the Secretary of State of the Home Office, annoy a huge number of people by giving, I think it might have been a comment in the Q&A at the daily briefing that the government gives, where she said that she was sorry if people feel that there have been failings, which, I mean, that comes in the context of NHS workers dying, many in the NHS and frontline people working on the front line saying that they still don't have the right PPE, personal protective equipment. So that comment obviously did not go down well.
Priti Patel has been under a lot of scrutiny recently. She also has been avoiding select committees. And for such a grave thing as NHS workers and their own personal health to give such a non-apology at this time is really disappointing to hear, especially in a government press briefing. In terms of PPE, there's also a developing row in Scotland over the prioritisation of equipment to England. This is still developing, so we don't have much information on it now, but definitely a lot of questions need to be asked if one part of the UK is being prioritised over the other. Yeah,
absolutely. I think the other thing that I spotted, I mean, PPE has obviously been a kind of key ask of the government, as in when a frontline worker is going to get the PPE that they need and why isn't the government moving quicker? But stepping away from what the government is doing to support frontline and essential workers. I have also seen this week that Tech UK, which represents a bunch of technology companies, including Facebook, Apple, Amazon, kind of all the big players, they are now asking the government to take another look at the digital services tax, which was meant to kind of increase the amount of tax that many of these companies are paying, and is necessary because many of these companies basically don't pay tax or pay very little tax in the UK and employ some seriously dodgy tax practices to minimise how much tax they're contributing.
We've also seen a hard border return in Ireland, where the Gardaí, who are the police force in Ireland, turning people away from the border at the weekend over the Easter. Now, this is because the Republic of Ireland themselves have a 2-kilometre limit on non-essential travel. So you have to keep within 2 kilometres of where you live, or else you can be stopped and fined and turned around by the police. And this happened at the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Another row developing in Northern Ireland is Health Minister Robin Swan has requested the assistance of the army, which in these times can be normal, but also Northern Ireland has a lot of history, and the main criticism for that has been they have not followed the proper procedure. It has not gone through the executive or through Stormont, and so it is a developing situation there right now as well, which is linked to our following topic. So let's kick off.
So now on to the main subject of this episode, which is about civil liberties and police powers. We're going to have Kevin on really shortly to talk a little bit more about police powers in detail. In responding to coronavirus, governments around the world, including our own, have had to impose restrictions on civil liberties and human rights, often as part of a package of emergency measures that allows the government to respond at the scale that it needs to deal with this public health emergency appropriately. According to a report by Open Democracy that was published this week, 2 billion people around the world are living in countries where parliaments have been shut down because of coronavirus. And so what we're seeing, not just in the UK, but around the world, is a lot of power being transferred to governments in order to enable governments to respond to the public health emergency appropriately. Some of these powers are quite clearly needed, but this imbalance of power can lead to the normalisation of government overreach and the permanent erosion of rights and liberties. And so we need to be asking questions about the political choices that our government is making, particularly because we live in a democracy. We need to be asking questions like, how extensive are these powers? Are they necessary and appropriate? How long are they going to last for? And who is going to be scrutinising them and how frequently? So the mere fact that the government has been given more power to respond to coronavirus is not in and of itself a concern, but we should perhaps be concerned when you look at the broader context of a culture of government overreach in the UK, particularly when we look at the fact that certain communities, even prior to coronavirus, have had their liberties and rights curtailed much more so than other communities. These communities are usually ones which are underrepresented in our political system. So people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, people with disabilities, and people in long-term care. So in the UK, the government has had powers handed to it mainly in the form of the Coronavirus Act, which was passed last month. It includes a whole range of measures that the government has said that it needs to save lives. So powers enabling the government to stop the spread of the virus, to reduce the resourcing and admin burden on public bodies, and to limit the impact of potential staffing shortages. And while the government has said that it needs these powers to save lives, these powers are also incredibly extensive and curtail many of the rights and liberties that we perhaps take for granted. The campaign group Liberty, for example, has said that this bill is without a doubt the biggest restriction on our individual and collective freedoms in a generation, while Big Brother Watch has described the Act as containing the most draconian powers in peacetime Britain. And I think we really see that when it comes to looking at how the police have been empowered to enforce restrictions on movement and freedom of assembly, for example. Trudy, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Yeah, I've also seen many campaigns group who've been calling for restrictions to police powers, like Liberty, as you just said, who are warning that these powers give too much space to be abused. And Netpol, for example, who we'll be speaking to shortly, calling for stricter time limits in which these powers are used and for safeguards to be put in place, saying in a recent article, "We would hope that everybody believes safeguards against abuse are always important. There is an obvious risk that communities already discriminated against by the police and immigration authorities will face a new way of categorizing them as a threat, in this case, a threat to public health." The bill also says obstructing an immigration officer or a constable in the exercise of this power would constitute a criminal offence, which leaves anyone objecting to the misuse of this sweeping power at risk of detention themselves.
And we've already seen examples of where the police have been incorrectly applying this legislation. The Metropolitan Police, for example, have already admitted to wrongly convicting a man under the coronavirus law. One of the overriding concerns about these powers is how broad they are, and that leaves open many questions around how they're being interpreted, how they're being applied, whether that's being done consistently across the country and across different police forces who might have differing interpretations, and that's even more likely to be the case if these powers are so poorly defined.
If you like this podcast, click the subscribe button and follow us on social media.
We've got a special guest here today, Kevin Blow, coordinator for Network for Police Monitoring, otherwise known as NetPol, to talk about how different communities are policed, and especially those communities who are already discriminated against. Can you tell me more about you and what NetPol does, Kevin?
Yeah, so Netpol has been around for 10 years. It was formed primarily to try and bring together those people who are involved in providing legal support around protests with those people like myself whose background was in the policing of local communities. So I spent a long time, 25 years, as part of a local police monitoring group in Newham and East London.
Interesting. Could you talk us through what changes to police powers were made in the Act and what impact this has had on the local communities?
Well, I can try. I mean, it's kind of difficult, really, in some ways to know because we have had some indication of the numbers of fines, for instance, that have been given for failure to practice physical distancing on the streets, but what we don't know yet is the extent to which those are as racially discriminatory as stop and search powers, because we only have a number at the moment. Now, obviously, anecdotally, some of the really high profile cases that have attracted attention, including the incident that took place in Manchester that was captured on film over the Easter bank holiday weekend, have involved people from racialized communities. But we don't know yet for certain. So much of the information that we've had coming in has been anecdotal. What we have seen is plenty of finger pointing and criminalising of what is perceived to be antisocial conduct.
Yeah, I see a lot, especially in Northern Ireland. I've seen it on the Met Police. I've seen that they have an online resource where you can essentially go on and basically inform on your neighbours if they aren't keeping to the rules. Have you had any sort of feedback from your own inbuilt communities about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's been a number of forces that have decided to go down that route. It's really interesting that for us, we have started having a conversation with an entirely new set of people who are what you might call not really our core audience, I suppose, for whom this is all new. This is a new experience. That idea that the police can decide where and when it's acceptable for people to go, where you can stop, whether it's somewhere that you're allowed to hang out, is a wake-up call for a lot of people, but obviously isn't really that different experience now from what it was before the lockdown started. Significantly for racialized and working class communities. I think one of the questions really is, why is it that the police's approach to this lockdown has been quite so gleefully gung-ho, really?
Yeah.
And although there is clearly going to be the case that there's going to be certain parts of the country where the people's experiences are much tougher, there are also going to be communities where people's experience is much more, ready for this, if you like. And I suspect that that a lot of the people contacting us and asking about their rights have never had this experience before.
Mm. In terms of this kind of gung-ho attitude that the police seem to be taking, where do you think that that's coming from? Is it cultural? Is it about? Does it relate to the kind of breadth of the powers and lack of clarity around the powers? Is it a combination of both? Is it something else?
I mean, I think those are all factors, but I think the basic starting point is, again, something that is an experience from those people who are already on the receiving end of oppressive policing all the time, which is that the police and the government don't trust people to follow the rules. So we have this situation where at the beginning of the lockdown, Boris Johnson was very reluctant to impose these measures, because he was talking, I can't remember the quote, but it's something about, it's very difficult. People are not going to want to do this. They're not going to want to not go to the pub. And what he meant was, we don't trust you to follow these rules. We think that that you're going to break them. And that has been reflected subsequently in the police's response. Now, the reality is that the government had to be dragged kicking and screaming towards implementing some form of measures at all. And the moment that those measures were introduced, partly because of that kind of general attitude of viewing us, the public, with suspicion and the need of control. This is the reason we had all these dire warnings about how everybody was going to breach the regulations. It's the reason why there was a massive spike in the number of fines that are issued in those first couple of days, and in one particular area, more fines than anywhere else in the country. It was a reaction to that idea that we need to crack down hard on people now, because if we don't make them fearful about the consequences, they're never going to comply with it. Of course, it was nonsense, because for all this effort this weekend, over the Easter bank holiday weekend, when everybody was saying, oh, it's going to be terrible and people are going to be out, you see the photographs of major cities all over the country. They were empty. I was cycling around on every day over the bank holiday weekend and was stunned in East London that there were so few people around.
Yeah, I think that comes into a broader trend, which has been quite striking, where the government has been really hesitant to clearly communicate to the public what the public needs to do to stop the spread of the virus. You mentioned kind of Boris Johnson's earlier advice to the public, not instruction, and he was kind of, he stood on a podium and kind of spoke about shaking hands with people, and when he was visiting hospitals, and the government was very reluctant to kind of set the example of what the public should be doing. And that's kind of bleeding into really toxic attitudes around what the public's self-perception is of what we're meant to be doing, what behaviour we should be complying with.
I think you're quite right about the reality that there's been confusion for people's powers. But despite that, and I think this is important to emphasise, despite the fact that there have been lots of reasons why you would have may have seen a mass refusal to comply with the lockdown measures, people have done it, and they've done it because they rather than the government have created this position. I don't think that needs to be seen as being something that's positive. What you mentioned earlier on was the negative, which is this idea that that people are denouncing their neighbours, and actually, I mean, I think in part that has been the online forms that have been created have been about trying to manage that process somewhat, because I think the police were overwhelmed with the number of reports that they had coming in, and didn't know how to cope with that at all.
Yeah. What steps do you think that the government needs to be taking to make sure that certain communities are not being over-policed or discriminated against?
Well, I think the dangers of where we go next is actually probably more important than what's happening now, because um, I mean it is important that there are challenges around the often petty and arbitrary restrictions are made on lockdown procedures, but I think the real concerns are likely to come later. When people start talking about an exit strategy from the lockdown. So I think our biggest concern is at that point where the number of COVID-19 cases starts to drop, people start to think the crisis is beginning to recede. And then what happens at that stage is that the public, the same fears that kind of drive that ringing up and reporting to the police for people who are not complying with the regulations, those same sort of incentives lead to people reporting on their neighbours for essentially for being ill, for driving demands to the police to hunt down potentially sick people because they're perceived to be some sort of threat to public health. And then what you end up doing is then having not the inconveniences and the arbitrary decisions and the fines, but actual detentions, the use of detention powers being used in a disproportionate and discriminatory way. And I think that's the real concern.
Yeah.
And I have to say, just to add to that, I think the targeting potential communities that are likely to be targeted as being seen as a greater risk are probably going to be those who have a higher incidence of positive testing. It's going to be the people who work on the front line, people who work in shops, people who work in the National Health Service, people who work in taxis and so on. In other words, people from racialised and working class communities.
Do you think there's also a risk of normalisation of these sort of powers as well?
Well, I mean, I think if you want any evidence of how fairly, draconian powers are introduced and then they become normalised, then you only have to look at the aftermath of 9/11. And to a certain extent, the aftermath of the 2005 attacks in London. What we had then was a broad acceptance that there was a need for increasingly sweeping and often terrifying powers, some of which were directly about detention, but some of which were about the use of surveillance. And who was on the receiving end of that? It was predominantly Muslims in urban areas. And that was normal. It's taken the best part of 2 decades for some of that to be reined back, for people to be challenging things like prevent, for instance. So yeah, I think the potential for this to become normalized is very high. We don't know whether this period is going to be repeated, whether we're now entering a period where contagion is a factor for all of us to be thinking about every year. And if it is, then the powers will stay in place. And particularly, surveillance powers will be expanded.
Just to wrap up, thanks very much, Kevin. Just to wrap up, I wanted to ask as well, with Nepal, you've been calling for a stricter time limit for which these powers are used and for safeguards to be put in place. Can I just ask what Nepal's position is on the impact of the new powers on civil liberties?
Well, we think that it was inevitable that they were going to be misused, that they're going to be used disproportionately and unfairly, because every time the police are given new powers, that's exactly what happens. In this particular instance, the powers are so sweeping that when people have said, well, what are my rights? It's really difficult to be able to answer that to a certain extent, because it's a state of emergency. The usual understanding of what rule of law means is pretty much out the window. So we can say, okay, you don't have to give your name and address, and you don't have to necessarily say where you're going. But if you're out on the streets, then the reality is that the police can stop you, and it very much depends on which officers you run into, whether that encounter is, frustrating and lacking in any sense of common sense, or whether it's, over quickly and not something that somebody's going to need to worry about. I think the difficulty with this is that, and this is particularly something I think worries us about the future, is that at the moment we're not in a position to do anything about it. we're all locked up behind our doors. It's very difficult to be able to document in this stuff. It's certainly really difficult to protest against it in anything like the usual way. And until that changes, I think pretty much the only thing we've been able to do is to document it, is to record it and to share that information. And it has had an impact. It has made the police back away from some of the worst successes, I think. That kind of constant highlighting the type of incidents are taking place around the country and the massive inconsistencies from one place to the next. So that's pretty much, I guess, what's going to happen next over the next 3 months, is we're going to have to keep on doing that.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Thanks so much for your time. And it was really interesting, definitely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We just heard from Kevin at Netpol about the impact that the extraordinary policing measures are having. Do you have any stories about the police going too far during lockdown enforcement, or who do you think would be the most impacted by police powers? We'd really like to hear from you. This is a really difficult time for all of us, and it's often really hard to know what we can do or how we can act. There might be the need for some extraordinary measures or emergency powers, but that doesn't mean that this is a time to sit back and just let them be used without scrutiny. So how can we as the public put pressure on the government to stop emergency powers being abused? If you want to stand with us to transform democracy, make sure that you sign up for our email updates.
And please let us know what you would like to hear on our next episode. Thanks so much for listening this week, and until next week.
Goodbye for now.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll be coming back next Thursday with more. Remember, you can reach us on social media and tell us what you think we should discuss next week. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share. Stay home, stay safe.